A few years ago, me and two of my buddies decided it would be a great idea to go winter camping deep in the Appalachian wilderness, which looking back now is probably the dumbest decision we ever made, because when people say those woods are endless, they're not exaggerating. You can drive for hours through those mountains and never see a single town, just miles and miles of dark forest and narrow winding roads that disappear into fog. And that's exactly where we were heading late one December. Afternoon, my friend Tyler was driving his beat-up pickup truck, while me and my other friend Jake sat in the back seat surrounded by camping gear and coolers. And Tyler kept telling us about this remote trail he'd heard about from a coworker. Apparently it was a place where almost nobody went during winter, which to us sounded perfect, because we wanted a quiet camping trip away from people. But as we got deeper into the mountains, the road started getting rougher, and the trees grew thicker and taller until it felt like the forest was closing around us. And I remember joking, saying, "Man, if something happens to us out here, nobody's ever going to find us." And Jake laughed and said, "Relax, dude, the only thing out here is deer and maybe a black bear." But Tyler didn't say anything and just kept driving. And about 20 minutes later, we reached this small dirt trail that barely looked like a road. Snow covered most of it, and there were no signs anywhere, just forest in every direction. So Tyler parked the truck and said, "All right, boys, this is it." And when we stepped outside, the cold hit us instantly. It had to be around 20 degrees, and the air felt so quiet, it almost seemed unnatural, like the forest itself was holding its breath. We grabbed our backpacks and started hiking down the trail while the sun slowly disappeared behind the mountains. And after about an hour of walking, the woods became so thick that the moonlight barely reached the ground. Our flashlights were the only thing lighting the path ahead, and the snow crunched loudly under our boots. And that's when Jake suddenly stopped walking and said, "Hold up, you guys hear that?" And we all froze listening. At first there was nothing but wind moving to the trees. Then somewhere behind us we heard a faint crunch in the snow like someone taking a step. Tyler turned around, shining his flashlight into the darkness, but there was nothing there, just trees and shadows. He shrugged and said, "Probably a deer." So we kept moving until we reached a small clearing where we decided to set up camp. Tyler started pitching the tent while Jake gathered wood for a fire, and I wandered a little further into the trees looking for dry branches. And I remember bending down to pick up a piece of wood when suddenly I got that weird feeling you sometimes get when someone's watching you, like your brain is trying to warn you about something before you even see it. So I slowly turned around and looked into the forest behind me, but all I could see were rows of dark tree trunks stretching endlessly into the night. And I told myself I was just being paranoid until I heard it again, a soft crunch in the snow somewhere to my left. Then another one a few seconds later, like footsteps moving carefully between the trees. My heart started pounding, because whatever was stopped the moment I turned my flashlight in that direction, and the woods went completely silent again. I grabbed the firewood and hurried back to camp trying to convince myself it was just an animal. But when I reached the fire, Tyler looked at my face and said, "Dude, you look like you saw a ghost." And I laughed it off, saying something was probably walking around the woods, but the truth was I didn't believe it was an animal anymore, because animals don't stop moving the exact moment you look at them. We sat around the fire eating instant noodles and talking about random stuff while the forest around us stayed dark and quiet. And after about 30 minutes, Tyler pulled a small trail camera out of his bag and said he wanted to set it up near camp to see what kind of animals passed through during the night. So he strapped it to a tree about 30 yards away facing the clearing. And Jake joked, saying maybe we catch Bigfoot walking through the snow, which made us laugh. But not long after that, we heard something that immediately killed the mood. It was a whistle coming from somewhere deep in the forest, a clear, human-like whistle that echoed through the trees. We all looked at each other, and Tyler said, "Tell me one of you guys just did that." But neither of us had. The whistle came again a few seconds later, except this time it sounded closer, like maybe 50 yards away. Jake grabbed his flashlight and pointed toward the tree, saying, "Hello." But the woods stayed silent, and then something moved just outside the firelight. I swear I saw a tall shadow slip behind one of the trees. Jake pointed his light in that direction, but whatever was had already disappeared. Tyler stood up and shouted, "Hey, who's out there?" But no one answered, and for a few minutes nothing happened until suddenly we heard the whistle again, except this time it came from the opposite side of the clearing. And that's when we realized something that made my stomach drop. Whatever was making that sound wasn't standing in one place. It was moving around us, slowly circling the campsite in the darkness just beyond firelight. Tyler lowered his voice and said, "Guys, nobody else should be out here." And right after he said that, we heard footsteps again, several of them crunching slowly through the snow somewhere in the trees. But every time we pointed our lights in that direction, the sound stopped instantly, like whatever was knew exactly when we were looking. And after about 10 minutes of this, Tyler finally said we should all just go into the tent and try to sleep because it was probably some local hunter messing with us. But none of us really believed that explanation. Still, we crawled inside the tent, leaving the fire burning low outside. And for a while, everything stayed quiet except for the wind shaking the branches overhead. I must have started drifting off because the next thing I remember was Jake suddenly whispering, "Guys, are you awake?" And Tyler groaned, asking what was wrong. And Jake said something that made the blood drain from my face. He said, "There are footprints outside the tent." Tyler unzipped the flap and shined his flashlight outside. And sure enough, they were fresh. Footprints in the snow circling the tent. But they didn't look like normal footprints. They were long and narrow and way too big to belong to any person we knew. And the strangest part was they stopped just a few feet from the tent, like whoever made them had been standing there watching us sleep. And while we were staring at them, we suddenly heard that whistle again. Except this time it came from just a few yards away in the darkness, followed by a low voice that sounded almost human whispering. Something we couldn't quite understand. And Tyler slowly turned off the flashlight and whispered, "Don't move, whatever that thing is, it's right outside." A couple years ago, I decided to take a solo hiking trip deep into the Appalachian wilderness because I've been working nonstop and just needed to clear my head. And if you've ever been out there, you know those mountains can feel endless, miles of thick forest, narrow dirt roads, and little ranger stations that look like they've been sitting there since the 1970s. So I drove about 6 hours into a remote part of the mountains where the nearest town was almost an hour away and stopped at a small wooden ranger station, checked the trail map before heading out. And that's where I met the park ranger who gave me a warning I really should have taken seriously. The guy looked like he'd spent his whole life in those woods. Older dude, thick beard, tired eyes. And when I told him which trail I planned to hike, he paused for a second and said in this slow southern accent, "You might want to stick to the lower trail. Folks been hearing strange things up there lately." And I laughed because I thought he meant bears or coyotes or something. But he shook his head and said something that stuck with me even now. He said, "If you hear somebody call your name from the woods, you don't answer it." And honest at the time, I figured he was just messing with me or trying to scare tourists. So I thanked him, grabbed my gear, and started hiking up the mountain trail around late afternoon. The weather was perfect, cold but clear, and the deeper I walked into the forest, the quieter everything got, until the only sound was my boots crunching on the dirt and leaves. After about 2 hours, the sun started dipping behind the mountains, so I found a small clearing and set up my tent for the night, cooked some instant food over a small camp stove, and sat there watching the last light fade through the trees while the woods slowly turned pitch black around me. And if you've never been in the Appalachian wilderness at night, it's hard to explain just how dark it gets. There's no city lights, no houses, nothing, just endless forest. And after a while, I crawled into my sleeping bag and tried to get some sleep, but sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up suddenly because I heard something moving outside the tent. At first, I thought it might be a deer, because animals pass through campsites all the time, but the footsteps sounded slow and deliberate, like someone walking carefully through the leaves. And I remember laying there listening as the steps circled around my tent once, then twice, and then they stopped completely. And that's when I heard a voice from somewhere in the woods quietly say my name. Not loud, not yelling, just a soft voice like someone trying to get my attention. And my first thought was maybe another hiker had gotten lost and needed help, but then I remembered exactly what that ranger had said earlier that day. If you hear somebody calling your name from the woods, you don't answer it. So I stayed completely still inside the tent trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. But a few seconds later, the voice said my name again, except this time it sounded closer, like maybe 10 or 15 feet away from the tent. And something about it felt wrong. The way it said my name was slightly off, like someone who had heard the word before, but didn't quite know how to say it naturally. And my heart started pounding, because the voice kept repeating it every couple minutes, always from a slightly different direction in the woods, like whatever it was that started slowly moving around my campsite. And after maybe 10 minutes of this, I finally worked up the nerve to grab my flashlight and unzip the tent just enough to shine the beam outside. And the forest was completely empty, just trees and fog and darkness stretching in every direction. But the moment I turned the light off and zipped the tent again, the voice came back, instantly whispering my name from the trees. And that's when I realized the most terrifying part of the whole thing. The voice didn't sound like a stranger anymore. It sounded exactly like the park ranger I had spoken to earlier that day, same deep southern accent, same slow tone, quietly calling my name from somewhere deep in the forest. And I swear on my life the ranger station was at least 6 miles down the mountain. There was absolutely no way he could have been standing outside my campsite in the middle of the night. And I spent the rest of that night wide awake listening to that voice circling the clearing, repeating my name over and over from the darkness, sometimes far away, sometimes just outside the tent, until right before sunrise when everything suddenly went quiet again. And the moment the first light hit the trees, I packed my gear faster than I ever had in my life and hiked straight back down the trail without stopping once. And when I reached the ranger station that morning, the same ranger was standing outside drinking coffee like nothing had happened. And before I could even say a word, he looked at me and asked one question that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. He said, "So, did you hear somebody call your name last night?" And when I asked him how he knew that would happen, he just stared at the forest behind me and said quietly, "Because whatever's out there in those mountains, it likes to learn people's voices." The scariest thing that ever happened to me in the Appalachian wilderness started with something that didn't make any sense, because the woods were completely empty when we got there, and I mean completely empty. No cars at the trailhead, no hikers on the trail, nothing but miles of forest and the sound of wind moving through the trees, which at the time felt peaceful. But looking back now, it should have been the first warning sign that something wasn't right out there. This happened about 3 years ago when me and my friend Aaron decided to spend a weekend backpacking through a remote part of the Appalachian Mountains in eastern Tennessee. Aaron had found the trail online and said it led to this amazing overlook where you could see the entire valley. And since we both loved hiking, we figured it would be a perfect 2-day trip. So we drove up early Saturday morning and reached the trailhead around noon. And the place looked exactly how you'd expect deep Appalachian wilderness to look. Thick forest everywhere, tall pine trees blocking most of the sunlight, and this narrow dirt trail disappearing straight into the woods like it had been carved to the mountains decades ago. We grabbed our packs and started hiking, and for the first couple hours, everything was completely normal. The air was cool, the forest smelled like pine and wet leaves, and every now and then we hear birds somewhere high in the trees. But the deeper we went, the quieter the woods became until eventually the only sound left was our footsteps on the trail. And that's when Aaron suddenly stopped walking and said something that I'll never forget. He said, "You feel like we're being followed?" And I laughed because at first it sounded ridiculous. But then I realized I had actually been feeling the same thing for the past 20 minutes. That weird sensation that someone is walking behind you just out of sight. So we stopped and listened for a moment. And sure enough, somewhere behind us, we heard a faint crunch on the trail, like someone had stepped on a branch. Both of us turned around expecting to see another hiker catching up to us, but the trail behind us was completely empty, just a narrow path winding through the trees with nobody there. Aaron shrugged and said it was probably just an animal moving through the brush, and we kept hiking. But after another 15 minutes, it happened again, another faint step behind us, and then another one a few seconds later, always just far, enough away that we couldn't see anything. And the weirdest part was every time we stopped walking, the sound stopped too, like whatever was behind us knew exactly when we paused. Eventually, the trail led us to a small clearing near the top of the mountain where we decided to set up camp for the night. The view was incredible, miles of forest stretching across the valley below us. And by the time the sun started setting, the entire sky turned orange behind the mountains. For a while, everything felt normal again, and we even joked about how paranoid we had been earlier on the trail. But that feeling didn't last long, because right after dark, we started hearing something moving around the forest just beyond our campsite, slow footsteps circling through the trees, sometimes to the left of us, sometimes to the right, always just outside the reach of our flashlights. And at first we figured it was probably a deer or maybe even a black bear passing through the area. But the steps sounded too deliberate, too careful, like someone trying not to be heard. And after maybe 10 minutes of this, Aaron grabbed his flashlight and walked a few steps toward the trees while shouting, "Hey, is someone out there?" But the woods stayed completely silent. Then something happened that instantly made both of us freeze. From somewhere deep in the forest, we heard a voice call out Aaron's name, clear as day, exactly the way I would say it, "Aaron!" The sound echoed through the trees like someone was standing maybe 50 yards away calling him. Aaron slowly turned and looked at me with this confused expression and said, "Dude, was that you?" And I shook my head because I hadn't said a word. The voice came again a few seconds later, except this time it sounded slightly different. The tone was off somehow, like someone trying to imitate the way a person speaks, but not get it exactly right. And that's when Aaron whispered something that made my stomach drop. He said, "It sounds like you." And before I could even respond, the voice called out again from the darkness. Except now it was saying my name, using Aaron's voice perfectly, same accent, same tone, like he was standing somewhere in the woods calling for me. And the most terrifying part was Aaron was standing right next to me when we heard it. We both grabbed our flashlights and shined them into the forest, but the trees were too thick to see anything beyond a few yards. The voice kept moving deeper into the woods, repeating our names every couple minutes, sometimes sounding like Aaron, sometimes sounding like me, and eventually it started getting closer, the calls echoing between the trees, until it sounded like the voice was circling our campsite the same way those footsteps had earlier on the trail. Neither of us said anything for a long time, because we both knew exactly what was happening. Something out there had been listening to us the entire day, learning our voices, and now it was using them to try to get one of us to walk into the forest. At one point, the voice spoke again just beyond the edge of the clearing, in Aaron's exact voice saying, "Hey man, come check this out." And I swear the tone sounded so real. For a second, my brain almost believed Aaron had actually said it. But when I turned toward him, he was standing perfectly still, staring at the trees with the same terrified expression on his face. And that's when we both heard something slowly step out of the woods just beyond the reach of the firelight. We couldn't see its face or even its full shape because the trees were blocking most of the light. But whatever it was stood way too tall to be a person and completely silent like it had been watching us the entire time. And after a few seconds it spoke again, using my own voice, whispering from the darkness, "Come here." And that was the moment we both grabbed our gear and ran straight down the trail without even looking back. We didn't stop running until we reached the trailhead hours later, sometime before sunrise. And to this day, I still remember the last thing we heard echoing through the trees behind us as we ran down that mountain. The sound of both our voices calling out from deep in the forest, repeating our names over and over like something out there had finally learned exactly how to sound human.